Hello, welcome to Oceanic Oracle. My name is Ari and today I'm going to be recommending some of my favourite myth retellings. I guess if you're new to my channel, hello. I'm an avid reader of mythology from all over the world, mostly Greek. I do try and read myths from all over the world. I find mythology fascinating. Today I'm going to be talking about some of my favourites. They're just books I would recommend to, I guess, people who are just dipping their foot into mythology for the first time. I just really love myths. I find myth and folklore absolutely fascinating, and I think it's just a fun way to learn about our past. I just find it really interesting because it's also combining historical knowledge. It just makes it really accessible to everyday readers. And I think that's really important, particularly nowadays. I'm just going to recommend some of these to you. I have a variety of myths from around the world. Quite a lot of it is ancient Greek. It's based on what I personally enjoy. I have romance, I have fantasy, I have magical realism, and I have non-fiction. I think I'm going to talk about my largest collection first. So let's get on with the Greek stuff. I am going to recommend the series that got me into Greek myth in the first place, I guess, the book series that actually got me to read Percy Jackson and the Olympians. This is a middle grade sort of modern retelling of Greek mythology. He's written quite a bit of stuff based on both like Greek, Roman, but also Egyptian and Norse. I do have a few other books by him coming up. This series is the first series that got me into Greek myth. It's very accessible, very easy to read. Middle grade books are a great way to introduce yourself into the sort of like to mythology, because the way that they explain it is very straightforward. I have read and reread this series so many times and I absolutely love this book. This is a great starting point if you're looking to get into Greek mythology and you don't want something that's as intense as, let's say, the Iliad or the Odyssey or stories inspired by them. I think it's a great place to start. Rick Riordan's writing is fantastic. You have ADHD and dyslexic representation in here, which I'm a fan of. I just really enjoy this book, and I think lots of people all over the world have enjoyed this book. So if you are looking to get into Greek myth and you don't know where to start, this is a great place to actually dip your foot in if you're interested in middle grade fiction. The stories that I'm going to talk about now, as opposed to being an introduction to general Greek myth, these books are sort of retellings of specific epic poems about things that went on in the Greek world, mainly the Odyssey and the Iliad, both by Homer. Now, Homer was a epic poet. Homer actually didn't write his stuff down. It wasn't noted down until many years after Homer had passed. The stories were all told verbally. These two are the base text for the next few books that I'm about to talk to you about. So be aware that they are base texts and they are inspired, so they are retellings or reimaginings of the Iliad and the Odyssey. The first book I'm going to talk about in this list is The Song of Achilles, which, as you see, I have annotated it. I just really enjoy this story. This is a retelling of the Iliad. This specifically follows Achilles and his companion Patroclus. This follows Patroclus's point of view. This starts before the Trojan War, before anything actually happens, and then finishes at the end of the Trojan War, basically. A lot of people really enjoy this book, but you have to be aware that there are some things that are everyone usually cries at the end. If you're aware of what happens in the Iliad, you'll know, but it still doesn't prepare you for what actually goes on. This is an Achillean romance, and I think it's tragic and beautiful. I really enjoy Madeline Miller's retelling of the Iliad and what goes on. I think lots of people would find it interesting. So if you're looking to get into epic poetry retellings and you don't really want to read the Iliad because it's massive, it's just a really good retelling and I highly recommend it. So there you go. The next book I have on here, which is inspired by the Iliad, is The Silence of the Girls by Pat Baker. This is a book told specifically through one of the spoils of war that the Greek men took, a girl called Rhesus, and it details her story and the story of the women who were impacted by the Trojan War. If you want a female tale of what happened during the Iliad, this is a great book to go with. One of the things that's really important is that we read not only from the male hero's point of view, which can be extremely biased, as you see in Homer, but it's important we discuss the impacts that it had on women as well. And this is a great book for that. I think it's really interesting, and it's a different take on a traditional Greek myth. If you're looking to get into sort of the story behind the Trojan War, and you're looking for a more in-depth conversation about how females were treated in Greece, and how the Greeks went to war, and their behavior behind that, this is a great one, and I think it's a really interesting book, so definitely recommend that. The next book that I'm going to recommend is Thousand Ships by Natalie Haynes. Natalie Haynes is one of my favourite classicists. My mum actually introduced her to me through her radio show, and she has a really interesting take on females and their portrayal in ancient Greece. Particularly, this book specifically follows both the Iliad and the Odyssey. So the story is told in different chapters by different women throughout the story. So obviously you have Helen's point of view, Helen of Troy, you have Briseis' point of view, you also have Clytemnestra's point of view. It's just a massive collection of different points of views from different women throughout the story, and talks about how they're feeling, and it tells the story of both the Iliad and the Odyssey. Obviously you have Penelope in there as well. Penelope is Odysseus's wife. If you already have sort of prior knowledge of the Iliad, I think it's a good book to actually read because you learn more about it. It's absolutely fascinating, and I really liked it. I gave it 4 stars when I read it. If you're into your Greek myth, if you want a female point of view similar to Silence of the Girls, this book is a good book to read. The last book that I want to recommend that's actually based on the Odyssey is Circe, so another Madeline Miller book. This one follows Circe, the daughter of the sun titan, or the titan that drags the sun across the sky, Helios. Circe is like the goddess of witchcraft, basically. She created magic. Circe is like girl power in a book. It's a different take on the Odyssey and focuses on things that most men may not actually see the first time that they read epic poetry, in the way that female godly beings were treated in comparison to mortal women. I really enjoyed this. I gave this 4 stars when I read it, and I think if you're looking for a Greek myth with girl power, Circe is a good one. I really enjoyed it, and I think if you're interested, you should definitely check it out. The last sort of retelling that I'm going to discuss based on Greek myth really is Ariadne by Jennifer Saint. This is one of my most beautiful books. This was an almost favourite of 2021. I gave this 4 stars. So this tells the story of Ariadne. If you know your Greek myth, you'll know that Ariadne is the daughter of King Minos, who lives on Crete. And if you know the myth, you know that there's a labyrinth that's under Crete. They've been cursed by the gods. Poseidon actually cursed her family because they were being quite disrespectful. And the story basically starts with Ariadne's life. So a big part of that is actually her meeting Theseus and the stuff that goes on with Athros. It follows Theseus and his journey through the labyrinth, and obviously his battle with the Minotaur. Not only does it focus on Ariadne's life, it also focuses on her sister's life. One of the things that I had an issue with is about 25% of the way through the book, they actually introduce dual points of view, and it really took me out of it. But I think if you know that going in, it won't take away your enjoyment of it. Again, this is a like focus on how women were treated in Greece. I really enjoyed this book. I already knew, like, I already know what goes on with Ariadne. I've always been fascinated with Ariadne purely because of my name, really. So I knew what was going to happen. But if you don't know what's going to happen and you're interested in the story of the labyrinth and Theseus, you should definitely pick it up. This book also follows Ariadne's sister, as I mentioned, and it follows her life after what happens in Crete and what happens with the Minotaur. So you also get her point of view. And if you know the stuff that goes around, if you know the stuff that happens to Ariadne's sister, you'll know what's going to happen in this book. I really enjoyed it. I think this gives it's an access point to give people like an introduction as to what went on with Minos and what went on with Ariadne and her life. I recommend it to people who want to look at a different Greek myth as opposed to just reading about the Odyssey and the Iliad, obviously. So that's a good one. Jennifer Saint is also coming out with a new book, Electra. I'm really excited to read that because I read the play Electra last year and it's just really fascinating. I'm looking forward to seeing what she does. I know beforehand that this is going to contain 3 points of view. Electra, her mother, Clytemnestra, and I can't remember the last one. But I'm really fascinated. I'm hoping I can get that when it comes out. Fingers crossed. The last book that I have to recommend in regards to like ancient Greek stuff is actually a non-fiction book. It's by Natalie Haynes and it's Pandora's Jar. So it's a non-fiction take on 7 important women in Greece in the ancient Greek times. It follows Pandora, hence the namesake, Jocasta, Helen, Medusa, the Amazons, Clytemnestra, Eurydice, Phaedaria, Medea, and Penelope. Again, this is a take on women in Greek myth, and I find it absolutely fascinating because, again, Greek myth is very male-centered, and I enjoy learning about like the female take on things. It's a really good non-fiction book. Talks about stuff that maybe you're not aware of in ancient Greek myth. If you're interested in learning about the actual like people or like the women in the stories, definitely pick this up. It's absolutely fantastic. We'll take a journey down the Mediterranean. We'll go down the River Nile and look at ancient Egypt. Again, one of my favorite series to read as an introduction to ancient Egyptian myth is The Crane Chronicles by Rick Riordan. This is the first book in the trilogy. This series is a lot shorter than Percy Jackson, but again, it's a middle grade. It's a really good book to act as an introduction to the ancient Egyptian pantheon. The stuff that I learned from here was really interesting because I already knew the basics in ancient Egyptian mythology because I would just sit in front of the TV and watch documentaries when I was younger. This is really interesting. It talks about the different portrayals in ancient Egypt. I find it really interesting. I enjoy the story. I love the story over the 3 books. This is a really good starting point if you're looking for more of an introduction beyond the like 5 initial gods in ancient Greece, because it also talks about the end of days and everything. So if you're interested in reading stuff about the Egyptians and looking into like their history and stuff that goes on, I highly recommend it. Another good place to start if you're looking for an introduction into Egyptian mythology is this non-fiction book. This is by another booktuber. She's a big classicist. She's actually she's doing her PhD in Greek mythology and classics. She has actually authored this introduction to Egyptian myth. She's actually coming out with this book later on this year, so it comes out in August. And I think if you're looking for a book with illustrations that introduces either yourself or kids to Egyptian myth, I think this is a good one. It also talks about not only the gods but also myths around ancient Egypt, and I think it sounds absolutely fascinating and I want to pick it up. So that's another option if you're interested. I guess if you're looking for Norse myth, like if you're interested in Norse mythology, the first book I would recommend is a non-fiction book. It's called Norse Mythology. This is by Neil Gaiman. I listened to this in September last year. It was really interesting. It contains a bunch of different myths. The thing is with Norse mythology, again, it wasn't really written down. It was all told verbally. So there isn't actually that much that details Norse myth. I really enjoyed listening to these myths and the stuff that was told in them. Another good book for like an introduction as to how Norse mythology works is again another Rick Riordan book. This is the Magnus Chase series. I think I read them in June last year. I do have a reading vlog for that, but it was very early on. This book is a really good introduction to the Vanir and the Aesir. So you have like a discussion on the Vanir and the differences between the Aesir and the Vanir. The Aesir are like your traditional Norse gods, so Thor is an Aesir god, Odin is an Aesir god, but it also talks about the Vanir. So the Vanir are sort of like Frey, so Frey and Freya are actually brother and sister, and it's a really interesting take on it because this book doesn't follow like the traditional, oh, I'm a son of Thor, this sort of thing. It's like, it's an interesting integration of all the gods, not just the Aesir, but also the Vanir. And I really enjoyed this. It's a good introduction to get you started, to see if you're interested in Norse myth. The story is fun. I think if you're looking for like an introduction, a middle grade introduction with like interesting characters, and I recommend that if you're interested in getting started in Norse myth. Not only is that a good introduction, but I'm sure there are other sort of like illustrated introductions to Norse myth. I know my dad has recommended a book called The Longships that I actually have here. This is sort of, again, this is more of a story on like a historical fiction as opposed to myth. But I'm really interested because it also talks about the gods and the way that everyday people would worship them, or Vikings in particular. An interesting, I guess, discussion point. The last mythos that I'm actually going to be discussing is Chinese mythology. Now, I have two books that I can recommend to you. I'll start with the one that I think is actually, so it's an easier book to read if you don't really know a lot about Chinese mythology, and that is Daughter of the Moon Goddess. Now, this is a retelling of the Mid-Autumn Myth. Is actually a fantasy book that about what follows afterwards. I think this is a really good book for like to introduce yourself to Chinese mythology, and particularly the Mid-Autumn Myth is plays a large part in this book. Obviously, it's a really accessible book. The way that it's told is very easy to understand. There are sections in here that are written in Mandarin, but those translations underneath, so you don't have to read Mandarin. It's extremely accessible. I think lots of people would actually learn a lot about the Chinese myth, the way that the gods and the immortal beings were actually portrayed and their abilities. I am really enjoying this. Highly recommend this book if you're looking to learn more about Chinese mythology. The last book that is a retelling of a specific Chinese story that I have to recommend is She Who Became the Sun. Now, this is a retelling of Mulan. Instead of your like Disney-ified version of Mulan, this actually follows the traditional myth and what most likely happened at the time that the story of Mulan was composed, because the actual story of Mulan is a ballad. It's a ballad. I really enjoyed this book when I read it. The way that this book was described to me before I actually picked it up was like the Song of Achilles, but for Mulan and Sapphic instead of Achillean. This is a Sapphic book. It is a lot more war-based, so it is definitely historical fiction. Like, it is a story of war. I think it also provides more of an insight as to the way that like the story was told, definitely more so than the Disney movies. The main character is not called Mulan. Zhu Congba and well, she takes her brother's name because her brother is believed to be destined for greatness while she will amount to nothing. If you're looking for a historical fiction about a point in history that you probably haven't read about, I would recommend it. So there we go. So yes, I have lots and lots of recommendations as to books you might want to read in order to get into mythology. I have tried to be as open as possible. I think middle grade is always a great thing to actually get introduced. There are other beautiful middle grade stories that I have not read yet. There are so many good myth retellings in middle grade that I don't have access to, that I have not read, but I am looking to actually get and read. I think middle grade is definitely one of the most accessible like genres in order to get in and be introduced to mythology. While there are adult books that discuss specific plot points, if you're more into those, one of the best things about it is that there are so many stories that are being told that are inspired by things, and just because I haven't mentioned it here doesn't mean it's not a good place to start. There are tons of adult romances that are inspired by Greek myths. There are tons and tons of myth retellings out there. If you have a myth retelling that you want to share with everyone, please feel free to leave them in the comments below. I'm always interested to see what other retellings there are out there. I find them fascinating. So leave them in the comments below. I hope you liked this video. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe if you want more bookish content. I hope you have a wonderful day or night, depending on when you're watching this. Stay safe, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye guys.